Welcome. Good afternoon. You are dialed into the January 19th public meeting teleconference to provide an update on the Willamette Valley System Environmental Impact Statement. We will begin the meeting in a few minutes, just letting everyone have a chance to sign in. While we're waiting for the folks to trickle in here at the very beginning, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Kelly James. I'll be the facilitator for today's public meeting. And while we wait, feel free to chat in your affiliation. All chats are going directly to our chat monitor. They won't be publicly visible. However, we will have a Q&A session at the end, and any questions we get in, our chat monitor will post for everyone to see as we go through them. But we would love to know who's on the line and where you're coming from. Thank you so much. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. I'm still seeing participants trickle in, so I want to give everyone a chance to log on before we get started. Thanks so much. Hello again, welcome, good afternoon. My name is Kelly James, and I think we'll get started now. I will be helping to facilitate today's public meeting on the Willamette Valley System Environmental Impact Statement. We will begin shortly. This environmental impact statement will often be referred to as the EIS by the presenters. So if you hear EIS a lot, that's why. I would like to first say how much we appreciate everyone's willingness to call in today and to learn more about the EIS. Although face-to-face is always preferable for a public meeting, we determined that a virtual teleconference was the safest option for members of the public and our team given the current COVID-19 pandemic. Your questions are just as important to us in a virtual setting as it is in person. And we have a team standing by this afternoon to ensure this virtual public meeting goes smoothly. The purpose of today's meeting is to give a brief to interested stakeholders and the public on the status of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Willamette Valley System Environmental Impact Statement. There will be also a question and answer portion of today's proceedings following the presentation to provide us with an opportunity to clarify any questions you may have. Please feel free to submit a question for the presenters using the chat function. You can enter a chat by clicking the chat icon in the lower right-hand corner. All questions submitted via the chat will be addressed directly during the Q&A session following the presentation. Questions you post to the chat will be sent directly to the chat monitor only and will not be visible to all participants. During the Q&A portion of the meeting, our chat monitor, Omar, will post them so that all participants on the WebEx can see each question as it is being addressed. I will read aloud each question received via the chat and ask one of our experts to respond. Please note, this is not a formal comment period, and your questions and comments will not be entered into the official NEPA record. The next formal comment period will be when the draft EIS is released for public review and comment. This public comment period is scheduled for the fall. Now, I'd like to introduce the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers team members who will be presenting and listening in on the phone this afternoon, including our Willamette Valley Project Operations Manager, Mr. Eric Peterson. In addition to Mr. Peterson, Kelly Wingard, the Project Manager, and Kathy Warner, the Water Supply Specialist and Technical Lead, will be presenting. In addition, Rich Pizowski and David Griffith, Fish Biologists, Tom Conning, Public Affairs Specialist, Wendy Jones, Natural Resource Manager, and Omar Ortiz, Environmental Resource Specialist, NEPA Lead, and tonight's chat monitor, and myself, Kelly James, Public Outreach Specialist, and tonight's meeting facilitator will be participating during the Q&A portion of the proceedings to help address your questions. I would now like to turn it over to the Willamette Valley Project Operations Manager, Mr. Eric Peterson, for opening remarks. I will just give me a second to find him on my list so that I can unmute him.
All right, I think I'm unmuted. Give me a thumbs up, Kelly, if you can. All right, thank you very much, Kelly. I appreciate this. Good afternoon, folks. My name is Eric Peterson. As Kelly said, I lead the team of people who operate and maintain the 13 dams and reservoirs, the associated lands, waters, habitat, and recreation areas that make up the Willamette Valley system for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This system began more than 70 years ago and was substantially completed over 50 years ago. We're here to manage flood risk by reducing the peak flows from winter storms that historically flooded the valley with high relative frequency. We estimate that this system prevents over $1 billion of flood damages in any given year. It provides a number of other important benefits as well, including fish and wildlife habitat, water quality, water supply, recreation, hydropower generation, and even navigation. We started the process of updating our environmental impact statement a couple of years ago. In 2019, we reached out and talked with a number of you in scoping meetings. We listened to your comments, and we developed an array of alternatives for operating and maintaining resources and assets moving forward. We currently have biologists, planners, managers, and engineers analyzing the potential impacts of these alternatives, and we expect to have a draft environmental impact statement out for public comment later this fall. We strive to walk a narrow path that balances many responsibilities. Most often, our priorities are in tension. They compete with one another. We appreciate your help in understanding that tension and helping to inform this EIS process. Your engagement helps us develop a solution that considers your perspective and hopefully finds balance. We're looking to find the best possible outcome to optimize the benefits of this system of dams and reservoirs for our communities, the environment, fish, wildlife, and all of us who live here. It is a delicate dance that has become increasingly more complex. We recognize that this is a huge process. The challenges in complying with the laws, reflecting regional and community values, driving sustainability while protecting lives and property is incredibly difficult. Depending on your specific interests, you'll feel like a winner or a loser at the end of this process. I'd ask you to consider the bigger picture, to recognize the tough balance we're attempting to facilitate, and to realize that everyone is giving up something and everyone is gaining something. No one is getting everything exactly the way that they wanted. Thanks much to the hardworking team of public servants working this process. Thanks also to those of you who've already participated in the process and who will be contributing as we release the draft EIS later this year. Thanks to our partners as well, who have been working with us on parts of this effort all along. Just a reminder, we are stewards of your resources. People are at the heart of what we do. We value your investment of time today. On behalf of the Portland District U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, I want to sincerely thank you for investing your time and energy in this important effort. I'll now turn the conversation back to Kelly to introduce Kelly Wingard, who's leading this EIS effort. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Eric. Now, Kelly Wingard will start us off with our presentation, providing a brief on where we're at with the environmental impact statement today. Kelly?
Hi, Kelly, and thank you, Kelly and Eric, for getting us started here. I think we can advance to the first slide. We really appreciate everyone's attendance here today. We also want to express great thanks to our cooperating agencies, the tribes noted on the top, the federal agencies in the middle, and various aspects of the state of Oregon. We've been working closely with them over the past years to develop the alternatives and get their feedback on where we are today. We really appreciate their engagement and also the public feedback that we get from this group. And as we move forward and get public comment later this year, we appreciate your guys' engagement. Next slide. Today's presentation is focused on kind of three aspects, but mostly the process that we've been through to develop the alternatives, to give you some vision into what we've gone through since you last heard from us, and then the measures and alternatives we're currently studying and analyzing in the EIS, and then the next steps that we plan for the EIS over the coming months before we come out with our draft EIS. Next slide. So just as an overarching agenda, we'll be talking about some background, where we are in the EIS schedule, just some general background for the EIS and BA process, purpose and need for our environmental impact statement, which is a key defining characteristic. We'll review that, as well as the objectives we considered in the development of our alternatives, and some just overarching notes about the compliance process. Then we'll talk a little bit about the specific formulation process we've been through in formulating our alternatives, the measures we've considered for upstream passage, downstream passage, flow, water quality, and measures common to all alternatives. And we'll have some discussion around the final array of alternatives, but I do want to encourage you to visit our public room, which I believe is noted in the chat, for full documentation of all measures that are in the suite of alternatives. And then we'll be having a question and answer session at the end, where we look forward to hearing some of your questions about where we are in our process. Next slide. So the EIS schedule. Today, we're focused on discussion of our alternatives development, step 3. So we heard during public scoping that it would be useful for the public to hear what alternatives we developed and what measures we've selected as part of our action alternatives. So this is in response to that. This is not a common public meeting milestone for an EIS process, but we heard during public comments in our scoping that this was a desired output for the public to see kind of this midway point, what measures we've selected in our alternatives development process. So we'll speak today about that process that we've been through, the measures that we've selected, and then we'll touch lightly on this next step. And my team's in that step right now, analyzing these alternatives and measures. We are currently in the assessment and the modeling processes for analyzing these measures and these alternatives, and that process is not complete yet. Neither is the selection of a preferred alternative. So that'll be information that's forthcoming with the draft EIS later this year in fall of 2022. And this is all before in 23 and 24 when we get to a final EIS and are able to publish a record of decision, currently forecast for 2024. Next slide. Just as a high-level project background, this environmental impact statement and biological assessment is for the Willamette Valley system. And this is a series of 13 dams and revetments that are located in the Willamette Valley. They have varied authorized purposes, including flood risk management, irrigation and water supply, water quality, hydropower, navigation, fish and wildlife, and recreation. All of these authorized purposes, as we'll see with our purpose and needs statement, are important in how we consider the operation and maintenance of these dams. Next slide. The Endangered Species Act compliance is also part, as we will see, of the purpose and needs statement, part of our consideration for selection of measures in our alternatives. There are 3 species that we'll be consulting on in our biological assessment process. That includes bull trout, upper Willamette River winter steelhead, upper Willamette River spring Chinook salmon. So we will be working with service agencies on consultation for these species per the Endangered Species Act. Next slide. The environmental impact statement process has as one of the initial criteria setting a purpose and needs statement. And this purpose and needs statement is a clear lens by which we select measures that can be considered for analysis in the environmental impact statement. The purpose and needs statement for our Willamette Valley EIS is the continued operations and maintenance of the Willamette Valley system, dams, and revetments in accordance with authorized project purposes while meeting Endangered Species Act obligation to avoid jeopardizing the continued existence of listed species. So for each of the measures, as Kathy will indicate later, we considered carefully the ability of measures to be in compliance inside the definition of this purpose and needs statement. Next slide. And these objectives helped us in the formulation of our alternatives. I won't read through each of these objectives, but we did emphasize different objectives across different alternatives, but considered them all as we were developing the alternatives. Kathy, our tech lead, will discuss which objectives were emphasized more heavily in the construction of a given alternative. They include things from water management, water in passage, fish passage survival at the Willamette Valley System dams, considering pollutant levels, and reduced spawning and rearing habitat competition caused by hatchery fish. So these are just among the objectives, but these 7 objectives were key in our mind during alternatives formulation processes. Next slide. So you've heard me mention the environmental impact statement as well as the biological assessment. And the biological assessment is part of the ESA process, and the environmental impact statement is part of the NEPA process. And these are 2 interacting processes that work hand in hand. So right now we are in the final selection of our alternatives for our environmental impact statement, and that will feed into and be part of our ESA process biological assessment, especially as we move forward to a preferred alternative and a proposed action for the biological assessment. These processes will continue to work together over the coming years. With that, I believe I'll be handing this over to Kathy Warner, the tech lead for this project and water supply specialist, and she'll be walking us through the processes by which we selected measures for the alternatives, as well as some key information about the alternatives that we've selected. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you, Kelly.
So next slide. Hello. So before I jump into the details of the alternative development and alternatives for the EIS, just wanted to give a quick overview of what an alternative is as well as a measure. So a measure is that feature or an activity that can be specifically implemented at a specific location. And then these measures are then used kind of as building blocks to build and put together in a variety of ways and in combinations to make an alternative. So measures can be structural. You can build something, you can build a dam, you can build a water control tower. An operational measure is then how you operate that dam as well as the reservoir throughout the year. And then again, these measures are combined into alternatives. Next slide. So this slide right here has a whole lot of information, and so we're going to walk through this slide by slide. We're going to start with the purpose and need and then talk about objectives and measures, and then getting all the way down to where we are right now, which is that comparing of alternatives. So this alternative formulation process has a lot of steps, starting with that purpose and need and really that measure brainstorming and from the scoping session. So we'll go ahead and just jump right into the next slide. So the first step was figuring out what the measures are. How are we going to operate this system and maintain the system into the future in coordination and with that Endangered Species Act? So we set our purpose and need statement, which Kelly went over, which is that continued operation and maintenance of the system. We developed project objectives. How can we measure if we're meeting the project purpose? And then we developed measures. So we held scoping meetings after that notice of intent. We held those scoping meetings in spring and early summer of 2019. And then the Corps also had a charrette, which is just a giant brainstorming session where kind of ideas get thrown out and put out on paper of what we can do to operate and maintain the system into the future. So all those activities resulted in a list of 717 measures. That's a lot of measures to go through and figure out how to make alternatives. So we went through a screening process. So initially, we went through just some initial screening. Are there duplicates? Are they outside the scope of the EIS? Are they really part of the no action alternative? And these were our initial screening criteria to help us whittle down the 717 measures. Next slide. The next step was to screen on the purpose and need as well as the constraints. So purpose and need, that continued operation and maintenance of the system in accordance with the ESA and with the authorized purposes. We also had a number of constraints. The main one, the primary function of these reservoirs and dams is that flood risk management as an authorized purpose. So we were not going to increase or change the flood risk management capability and potential of the system. We also didn't want, or we screened out anything that could have serious dam safety risks from further consideration. We also screened out alternate measures that would eliminate a project purpose from hydropower or water supply. And so we had to meet those project purposes at least once within that period of record. And the period of record is our hydrology data set that we use to analyze these measures. So after we screened the initial screening, the purpose and need, as well as the constraints, we ended up with 180 measures remaining. That's still a pretty big list to get through to form alternatives. So we did some more screening. Next slide. Yeah. So the next step was our objectives. So back on slide 6, Kelly talked about the objectives of the project, water management flexibility, increasing survival of those ESA species, hydropower, among another ones. So we made sure that the measure actually would meet one of those project objectives. For example, in-stream flow gauges didn't relate to one of those objectives, so that one was screened out. Bathrooms on reservoirs, great idea, cuts down on some water quality issues, but again, not related to one of our project objectives. So when we did that, we ended up with 99 measures. And then the next slide, please. Next came the technical screening. Is something technically feasible? Can we achieve it? Is there a major risk that it just won't work? Or does it have unacceptable environmental effects? And could it be done within that time frame, and would the effects be noticeable? So with that, we moved on to our next phase. Next slide. Where we refined those measures. So we ended up with 99, and we refined all those measures through the technical screening, and we ended up with 23 measures remaining. And these measures fell into categories. So we had fish passage measures, 8 measures, a mix of structural and operational. We've got drawdowns, we had a structural downstream passage, meaning a floating fish collector, and improving adult facilities or constructing adult fish facilities. We also had 6 water quality measures, a temperature control tower, or modifying existing outlets and using those existing outlets to help control water temperatures. And also some degassing and measures to reduce total dissolved gas, or TDG. We also had measures related to flow, changing the flows at the dams, the minimum flows. We had reduction of those minimum flows, as well as using the water stored below the conservation pool in those inactive pools or the power pools to help support stream augmentation downstream of the dams. There were also measures that we put into the category of common to all. It didn't seem appropriate to only put them in one alternative versus the other. And those were the hatchery changes, revetments, gravel augmentation, so adding gravel below the dams for some habitat improvement as the dams do stop some gravel movement from upper in the watershed down. Also maintenance, we need to keep maintaining the dams, and so would be common to all the alternatives. Also an annual water management plan. So we've been working on this ever since 2008. We have an annual water management plan that gets coordinated on that annual basis once we have a better idea of how much water will be in the reservoirs and to operate those reservoirs. Next slide. So we ended up with our list of measures, and that's that blue box on the right-hand side of refined measures. So the next step in the process is coming up with the alternatives. So we defined our alternative strategies, looking at those objectives. The next step was assigning the measures and then formulating the alternatives. So when we looked at the objectives and all the measures, the alternative strategies that really popped out were a storage-focused measure. So this one would be increasing our chance of refill of the reservoirs, but also including that fish passage as is required to meet that ESA need. An integrated fish passage alternative is a combination and mix of both structural and operational measures for fish passage. And the third alternative was fish passage via operational means only. And then fourth is structural fish passage alternative. And so now we'll jump into the alternatives themselves, and we'll talk about kind of what the concepts within each in more detail. Next slide. Before we do that, we're just going to jump into measures common to all alternatives. This slide is available at the end of the presentation, also via our website, and more information is on the virtual room too in more detail. But just kind of a brief graphical representation. Again, the gravel, a hatchery program, revetments, and then also one that wasn't mentioned earlier was those adult fish release locations. So we'll be collecting adult fish below the dams, and then they need to be transported and released up into suitable spawning habitat. So that's also will be applied to all of the alternatives. Next slide. So the NAA is required as part of NEPA, and it's at no action alternatives. What happens if we didn't do in this EIS or change anything from what we're doing right now? And so that was defined as a point in time in April 2019 when we initiated this project. And it includes all the ongoing and the scheduled maintenance and all the current actions and current structures, including ones that were reasonably foreseeable to be constructed. Next slide. Alternative 1. So this is the structures-focused alternative. We wanted to, not structures-focused, sorry, it's the increasing the chance of refill and making sure those reservoirs as high as we can fill them for multiple purposes. And so this also involves structural passage for downstream fish passage because those structures are able to operate on that full range of reservoir elevations, and therefore we're able to refill those reservoirs. So we have key defining elements are, this one had a reduced flows, going back to House Document 531 flows, that original authorized minimum flows. Also included downstream passage via structures and some water quality structures as well. And a new adult fish facility at Green Peter, and the drop structures, improving the drop structures on the Long Tom River. We also included lamprey passage at those adult fish facilities. Next slide. So alternative 2, here you'll see a 2A and a 2B. And so alternative 2 is that integrated focused option. So it's a mix of structures and operational passage for fish, for juvenile fish passage. So the focus here is it's just that combination, what works best at each location. And the only difference you'll see between this slide and the next slide is alternative 2A and 2B. The difference there is the fish passage at Cougar. So in 2A, that fish passage is a structural fish passage, or that floating screen structure that's shown in the graphic on the right of the slide. Other features are a structural passage at Detroit, and then an operational passage at Green Peter. And then there's a structural passage as well in the Middle Fork at the Lookout Point Reservoir. We'd also be constructing adult fish facility at Green Peter and improving lamprey passage as well. And so the next slide, 2B, this would include all of the measures. This would be the same between 2A and 2B, except for that downstream fish passage measure and method at Cougar. This would involve a drawdown to the diversion tunnel at Cougar Dam. So it's not using the regulating outlets, but it would go all the way down to the bottom with the diversion tunnel. And that would, that is it for the alternative 2. So let's jump into alternative 3. So alternative 3 was the operational focus measure. So you'll see here 3A and 3B. And the reason we have 2 alternatives under 3 is really wanting to be able to fully analyze the different operations at each dam. And so we did this by including operational passage, drawdowns to the regulating outlets, or also spill. Surface spill, not just for temperature management, but also for fish passage. And so having those juveniles go over the spillway in the spring versus going down to the regulating outlet in the spring. So in 3A and 3B, each of the larger reservoirs also includes a drawdown down to the reservoir, the regulating outlet in the fall. And by fall, we're talking late November into early December. So not September, not early October, but that later fall time period. And so in 3A and 3B, while we talk about the regulating outlets, the difference also with 3A and 3B applies to Cougar. So in Cougar 3A, we analyzed going down to and using the regulating outlets for juvenile fish passage. And then for alternative 3B, we analyzed going all the way down to the diversion tunnel to pass those fish. And that diversion tunnel operation would be similar to Fall Creek, where that reservoir is all the way down to the bottom and a very, very minimal pool remaining. This would also involve constructing adult fish facilities. While that is a structural component, there's no operational way to get the adult fish from downstream of the dam to the upstream dam. So they need to be collected and then hauled upstream of the dam. Also included would be Pacific Lamprey Passage facilities as needed. Next slide. So alternative 4 is our structural focus measure, and that's the structures for passing downstream passage of juvenile fish. So we take that structures-based approach also for water quality. So not just the downstream passage of juvenile fish, but structural measures to improve water quality, namely temperature and total dissolved gas. So this was our focus here, including a structure at Detroit. We've got different structures elsewhere as well. So on the website, this PowerPoint includes some extra slides for additional information, because I know these slides are pretty text heavy. And so on the website, you'll see additional slides that detail out the measures for fish passage at each of the dams comparison across the alternatives. And then there's another slide that talks about comparing and shows the graphical representation of water quality measures for each alternative at each location. And so that's some information that can be digested later. And there's also a lot of this information on the virtual room that you can go through at your pace and digest a little bit more in depth. Next slide. So I know that was a lot of information thrown out, and there's a lot of details. You know, the team has been working really hard for the last it's actually feeling closer to 3 years now, since we had those scoping meetings. But it's been taking a lot of time to digest all the information that was provided by you, the public, as well as all the information we have in-house to figure out what different alternatives and ways we have to operate and maintain this complex system into the long term. So now we're at the comparing of the alternatives. We have run various models, hydrology models. We're working on the fish models right now. And so we can really compare all of these alternatives against a large list of criteria to see how they perform, what impacts they have, what benefits they may have, or what just changes they could have to a variety of criteria, including water supply, recreation, hydropower. And that's what we're doing right now, is we're working on that comparing of the alternatives. The next step would be developing that preferred alternative. So that's what we're in process of right now. And we're working on that almost as we speak. Within that preferred alternative, it's also important to note that we'll include an implementation plan. So obviously, not every single thing can be implemented on day one as soon as this EIS is done. So it'll include a stepwise approach to how we plan to implement that preferred alternative into the future. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Kelly Wingard to talk about what's next for this EIS. And thank you so much for coming and listening to what we've been doing for the last couple of years.
Thank you, Kathy. Next slide. So just to remind you, this is a repeat of earlier on in our presentation, but today we reviewed our alternatives development, the process by which we selected measures for our action alternatives and the measures common to all alternatives. Our next step that our team's currently working on is analyzing the impacts of these alternatives and selecting a preferred alternative. That information will be coming to the public with the draft EIS in the fall of 2022. So after today, that'll be our next public touch point to expect. Next slide. For more information, please do visit our website and our virtual room. At this point, I think I can turn it over to Kelly Jane. We appreciate your attendance today.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Kathy. So now we will actually be moving on to the Q&A portion of the meeting. We will pause for a moment to allow people to add their questions to the chat if you have not already done so. As I mentioned before, all questions in the chat will be directed to the chat monitor only. As our team responds to each question, Omar will post it in the chat so all of the participants can read the question as it is addressed. Additionally, we want to provide those of you who are able to call in and are not logged into the web a chance to ask questions. Once we have gone through all the questions that have been posted to the chat, I will go through each phone number in the participants list that isn't attributed to an attendee on the web. To do this, I will open the line one at a time and will call out the area code and the last 2 digits as I see them of your number and ask you to state your question. If you do not wish to ask a question, please just say no questions and I will mute your line and move on to the next caller. Some of you may have been both logged into the webinar and called in separately. I respectfully request that you post your questions to the chat and pass when prompted to verbally ask your question. This will help us keep within the time allotted for the meeting. Each speaker will have 2 minutes if I call on you to verbally ask your question to provide it. I will notify you when you have 30 seconds remaining. At that time, you will hear me say 30 seconds. When 2 minutes have passed, I will let you know your time has ended and I will mute your line to prepare for the next caller. If you do not use your full 2 minutes, you may let us know that you have finished speaking and I will mute your line and we'll answer your question. Please note all questions provided during this teleconference will be recorded and posted with the presentation to a publicly accessible website for interested stakeholders who are not able to attend tonight's meeting. Any personal information you share on the call will become public. Agency officials will remain on the line for the entirety of the call to answer your questions. Currently, there are 57 participants who have 50 participants total. Looking at the questions I have so far, we have 4 who have chatted in some questions. And so, Omar, we're now ready for the first questions to be submitted via the chat. From Mr. Williams, are you looking at non-agency dams like EWEB, Waterville Dam, as a constraint on decision making? Kathy Warner, I think that you would be a great person to answer this question.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to make sure I have my video and my mute button off. So the private facilities are not a constraint. We'll screen the measure, based on that consideration of effects, or we'll analyze effects to those private facilities. But right now, private facilities are not a constraint.
Thank you, Kathy. I think the next question would also probably be good for you to answer. Omar, if you could post it. From Rick Dwyer, how are any of these alternatives affected by the pool restrictions implemented at Detroit last year? I believe this is the interim risk reduction measures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these interim risk reduction measures, or IRRM, are considering temporary in nature until a permanent plan is in place for fixing that specific issue. And so the EIS is looking at a long-term operation of this facility, of these facilities. And so those IRRMs are not considered within the EIS measure development or alternative development process. We will be considering those and documenting those in the EIS. Over.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Next question, Omar. So So from Casey McAfee, will the EIS consider the possibility of deauthorizing power at Detroit and Cougar and Big Cliff dams? Kathy or Kelly?
Yeah, I can tackle that one. The EIS purpose and needs statement considers measures that are in accordance with our authorized purposes. We are looking at operations outside the Corps' current authorities and operations, considering in accordance to be that the measure could be operationalized once in the period of record in a given year. This isn't a study for elimination or deauthorization of our authorized purposes, so studying deauthorization isn't part of our study work.
All right, thank you. Next question. Again, I'm thinking either Kathy or Kelly can answer this one. As soon as Omar has a chance to post it for folks to see. From Jennifer Fairbrother, Native Fish Society, when formulating alternatives, did the agency screen out potential measures that would reduce hydropower production?
Yeah, so this measure was, any measures that would reduce hydropower production were not screened out. Measures that would eliminate hydropower were screened out. So even though a measure may have an effect to an authorized purpose, as long as it didn't eliminate a project purpose, it was carried forward for further consideration.
Thank you. All right, next question, again for Kathy.
Is that the authorized purpose one again? Yeah,
no.
The alternative formulation?
I'm just waiting for Omar to, oh, I guess it skipped ahead. Yes. How is the alternative formulation accounting for potential congressional changes to authorized purpose of hydropower production?
So in that regard, so that is an unknown. That is not within our purview right now. So we are looking at that continued operation and maintenance of the system with the existing authorized purposes as they are right now.
Next question. All right, from Steve Dearden. Kathy mentioned that upstream passage was not possible, I believe, at Detroit. Therefore, the fish had to be captured and trucked. Curious as to what upstream passage technologies were evaluated to reach this conclusion, or was it just the existence of Minto that drove this conclusion?
Yeah, so the Willamette Valley dams are considered high head dams, unlike the Columbia River dams, the lower Columbia River dams, which are those low head dams. And so on those facilities in the Columbia, you see fish ladders being used, and that just isn't feasible at technically feasible at these high head dams in the Willamette. And so upstream passage using that adult trap and haul has been a proven approach successfully to move fish upstream until their spawning habitats. And that is what was considered and envisioned for the Willamette Valley system moving forward.
All right, next question, Omar. From Jennifer Fairbrother, Native Fish Society, how is the agency weighing ESA obligations versus other non-flood control project purposes? And I can open it up to the team. I can also help a little bit in answering this question, but I'll wait to see if anyone on the team wants to raise their hand. David Griffith, I will unmute you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great, sorry about that. So as part of this process, we're working close with both services, National Marine Fisheries Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to ensure any proposed action from the EIS does not jeopardize the species. And that's how we're ensuring we're meeting our obligations under ESA, is partnering closely with them and ensuring that the proposed action is not going to jeopardize the species.
Thank you, Griff. Next question, Omar. Once the necessary changes are decided upon, how will they be funded and when? Kelly Wingard, would you like to answer this one?
Yeah, Kelly Jane.
From Bill Crampton.
Yeah, thanks. So USACE is working with its vertical chain, understanding the costs of these alternatives as part of the assessment that's going on right now. And over the coming years, we will work with our vertical chain and supply information to Congress to emphasize a budget for these actions. We will be working against an implementation and an adaptive management plan, looking for implementation of the measures on a schedule.
Thank you, Kelly. Omar, it looks like we're through all of the questions that have been submitted during chat. Is that correct? Give folks a minute if you have a question brewing you'd like to post. All right. Well, then I guess I will move on to opening it up to the folks on the phone to give you all a chance to ask questions if you have them. I will, like I said, I will list the first 3 numbers of area code and the last 2 digits of your phone number and unmute you. If you have a question, please provide it. If not, just say no questions and we'll move on to the next person. The first caller I'll be calling on is at the number 971 ending in 14. All right, it seems you muted yourself, so I'm going to assume you do not have a question. I can come back at the end just in case one comes back. Okay, next person is 971 ending in 52. All right, hearing none, I guess we have concluded the end of our queue of callers, and no new questions have come in through the chat. So with that, I want to thank all of you for your interest, your time, and your flexibility in participating in this informational meeting. We encourage you to continue checking for updates on the project website, which I will spell out now for those on the phone. It is https://www.nwp.usace.army.mil//Willamette-Valley/System-Valley/Evaluation-EIS/. Thank you so much, and we hope you all have a wonderful day.
Kelly, there was one more comment that Omar just put in.
Oh, darn. I'm sorry. I'm just seeing that I did miss this last comment from Marley's, I apologize if I mispronounce your name, Wiranga. How are you incorporating predicted and/or modeled changes due to climate change into your analysis of the alternatives? I believe, Kathy, you might be able to answer this. If not, I thought I saw our climate change person on.
Yeah, I can answer this one.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, so we're looking at qualitatively. So we have a lot of information, quantitative information, and then we will be applying that qualitatively to look at the effects that climate change could have on the alternatives going into the future. But we are not doing any modeled climate change scenarios with the analysis of the alternatives.
Thank you, Kathy. Apologies, hopefully that person is still online. My chat wasn't updating or scrolling for me. All right, well, our folks will be on for a few more minutes. If any other questions come in, we'll keep checking. Thank you so much for all of those who hung on and caught that. Again, this presentation and all the Q&A session will be recorded and posted to the website. For all those who remain on the line, we will be closing down the room at 1 p.m. It's a little earlier than we thought, but seems like we were able to get through all the questions in a timely manner. So again, thank you all for your time. We really appreciate your interest. Please feel free to go to these sites to learn more about the project. And if you want to be added to the distribution list to hear updates from us via email, you can send an email to willamette.eis@usace.army.mil with the subject line subscribe. Thank you so much and have a great day.